I'm sorry, Miss Reynolds, but your name isn't on our guest list. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I stood frozen in the grand entrance of the historic Victorian hotel, my knuckles white as I clutched my vintage leather purse. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs while a wave of dizziness washed over me. The event planner, a polished woman in her 40s with immaculate hair and a tailored navy suit, regarded me with professional sympathy that couldn't quite mask the pity in her eyes. I absolutely despised that look. There must be some mistake, I insisted, forcing my lips into a tight, dignified smile. My voice remained steady despite the knot of humiliation twisting in my stomach. Diane is my sister. I'm Margaret Reynolds. The planner hesitated visibly, her manicured fingers hovering over the tablet she held. She glanced up at me, taking in my sensible dress and carefully styled gray streaked hair, then back down at her screen, scrolling through names with exaggerated care. But I recognized that first flicker of hesitation, that subtle shift in her expression. The truth was painfully clear. My name wasn't going to magically appear on that list. My stomach plummeted to the polished marble floor beneath us. Would you mind checking once more? I asked, my fingers instinctively tightening around the carefully wrapped package I'd brought. The meticulously crafted architectural model inside represented months of painstaking work, a labor of love. She nodded briskly, tapping through several screens while I stood there, acutely aware of every passing second. The elegant strains of chamber music drifted from the ballroom behind her, punctuated by the delicate clink of champagne glasses and the gentle murmur of sophisticated conversation. Through the partially open doors, I caught glimpses of crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements, beauty I had helped pay for years ago when I supported Diane through her divorce. The planner's expression shifted subtly. I recognized that look immediately, the careful arrangement of features before delivering unwelcome news. She lowered her voice confidentially. I truly apologize, Miss Reynolds, but your name definitely isn't here. I've checked the entire guest database. I inhaled deeply, struggling to maintain my composure. This makes absolutely no sense, I said, hearing the slight tremor in my voice despite my efforts. Diana's my sister. We've been through everything together. I should certainly be on that list. The woman glanced discreetly around the opulent lobby, checking for potential eavesdroppers. Then, leaning slightly closer, she whispered, "It wasn't an oversight. Your mother specifically instructed that you weren't to be included. She was quite explicit about security and space limitations for VIP guests only." For several heartbeats, all I could hear was blood rushing in my ears. The chandelier lights suddenly seemed too bright, too harsh. 58 years old, and here I was, being humiliated like a schoolgirl. "I beg your pardon?" My voice sounded distant, even to myself. She shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Mrs. Reynolds personally reviewed the final guest list and specified you weren't to be admitted under any circumstances," she continued in hushed tones, as though a quieter delivery might somehow soften the devastating impact. "I'm truly sorry. I understand this must be awkward." Awkward? What an utterly inadequate word. My own mother had deliberately erased me from my sister's second wedding celebration, a day when family should matter most, and this woman called it awkward. A peculiar coldness spread through my body, replacing the initial shock with something darker and more controlled. "I see," I managed, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. But I didn't see, not really. Yes, Constance had always favored Diane, showering her with advantages and approval. That wasn't news. But to explicitly ban me from this milestone event, to actively deny my existence on what should have been a joyous family occasion, even for my mother, this represented a breathtaking new threshold of cruelty. I stood motionless, pulse pounding in my temples, weighing my options. I could demand an explanation, march directly into that ballroom, and confront them all. But what would that accomplish except public humiliation? Would my mother feign innocent surprise? Would Diane stare at me in confusion, realizing too late what had been orchestrated? Or worse, perhaps she already knew and had approved it. The thought sent a fresh stab of pain through my chest. I squared my shoulders, clinging to the dignity I'd cultivated through decades of similar disappointments. I wouldn't debase myself by causing a scene. If they so clearly didn't want me here, I certainly wouldn't force my presence upon them. I gazed down at the elegantly wrapped package in my hands, the architectural model I'd spent countless evenings creating after my volunteer work at the library. It was a perfect replica of our father's most celebrated building, accompanied by a hand-bound book chronicling our family history that I'd lovingly assembled using my librarian's skills. Inside were photographs, stories, and memories I'd preserved when no one else had bothered. It had taken nearly 4 months to complete, each detail a testament to Thomas Reynolds' artistic legacy, a heritage Diane and I once cherished together before wealth and status erected barriers between us. With deliberate calmness, I approached the concierge desk where an attentive young man watched our exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Please ensure this reaches the bride," I said, gently placing the package on the polished counter. My voice didn't waver. The card tucked beneath the satin ribbon read simply, "For Diane. May your new journey bring fulfillment. Your sister, Margaret." I adjusted the strap of my purse and turned toward the massive mahogany doors leading outside. The moment my sensible heels connected with the marble floor, I felt the weight of curious stares boring into my back. Whispers rippled through the gathering of expensively dressed guests in the lobby, wealthy art patrons and collectors who'd never remember my name, but would certainly recall this moment of public rejection. The humiliation pressed against my chest like a physical weight, but I forced myself to maintain perfect posture, just as Dad had always taught us. Outside, the evening air struck my flushed face with refreshing sharpness. The street pulsed with the distinctive rhythm of downtown traffic. Luxury cars glided past, their headlights illuminating the rain-slicked sidewalks where doormen assisted elegantly dressed couples from vehicles worth more than my annual pension. Animated conversation and laughter cascaded from the hotel's adjoining restaurant where guests clinked glasses in celebration. A celebration I was explicitly forbidden to join. I drew a measured breath, fighting to regain my equilibrium. My hands trembled visibly as I fumbled in my purse for my phone. I shouldn't have been surprised by this rejection. This wasn't remotely the first time my mother had rendered me invisible when my presence proved inconvenient to her carefully curated image. Throughout our childhood, I'd always been the afterthought in Constance's calculations. While Diane shone as her golden child who could do no wrong, I was the disappointment, the burden, the one who wasted her potential on a career Constance deemed beneath our family's station. The one who chose books and knowledge over social connections and wealth. I had postponed my own career advancement to help maintain Dad's architectural practice during his illness. I depleted my retirement savings to fund Diane's art studies in Europe and her first gallery opening. When Dad finally succumbed to his long illness, I'd foolishly hoped that shared grief might bridge the chasm between my mother and me. But affection had never been freely given in the Reynolds household. It had always been transactional, conditional, and apparently, I had never accumulated sufficient value to merit inclusion. I exhaled sharply, gripping my phone with unnecessary force. My thumb hovered over Diane's contact information. Did she realize what had happened? Did she know I'd been deliberately excluded from her wedding to Wesley Montgomery? That our mother had determined I wasn't worthy of witnessing this milestone? I hesitated briefly, then pressed the call button before I could reconsider. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then switched to voicemail. Not even the courtesy of an answer. I stared at my phone's darkened screen for what felt like an eternity before finally tucking it back into my purse with trembling fingers. A familiar heaviness settled in my chest. What had I expected, really? That Diane would somehow sense my call amidst the celebration of her second marriage? That she'd excuse herself from her new husband Wesley's side to speak with the sister who hadn't made the exclusive guest list? Or perhaps the truth was far more painful. Perhaps she had seen my name flash across her screen and deliberately chosen to ignore it, complicit in my exclusion. The thought twisted my insides like a knife, sharp and unexpected despite decades of similar disappointments. I turned away from the majestic hotel facade, its Victorian grandeur now seeming to mock me with its inaccessibility. The rain had started again, gentle but persistent, reflecting the street lights in shimmering patterns across the pavement. I stepped toward the curb, arm raised to hail a passing taxi, grateful that the raindrops mingling with the tears I refused to acknowledge. I absolutely would not break down here, not where someone might see. not where they might report back to Constance that her eldest daughter had crumbled under the weight of her rejection. "Where to, ma'am?" the taxi driver asked as I settled into the worn leather seat. "Thompson Square, please," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside me. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of the hotel through the rain-streaked window, light spilling from its windows, valet attendants ushering guests inside, the celebration continuing without the slightest interruption. My fingers found the worn reading glasses in my purse, tracing their familiar outline. Dad had given me my first pair when I started working in his architectural firm, helping with paperwork while pursuing my library science degree. "Foreseeing the details others miss," he'd said. The memories strengthened my resolve. If Constance and Diane believed they could simply erase me from their narrative, after all I'd sacrificed, after all I'd contributed, they would soon discover their miscalculation. This humiliation wouldn't be the conclusion of my story, but rather the catalyst for something entirely new. The librarian in me knew that every compelling narrative required conflict before resolution. And this particular story was far from finished. The cab ride to my condominium felt interminable. Rain streaked across the windows, blurring the city lights into watercolor smudges of red, blue, and yellow that reflected my fractured emotional state. My hands couldn't stay still, alternately clutching my purse and anxiously smoothing my skirt. My thoughts raced chaotically, examining and discarding possible explanations for what had just happened. The event planner's carefully measured words kept echoing through my mind. "Your mother specifically instructed that you weren't to be included." I exhaled unsteadily, my breath fogging the cool glass as I leaned my forehead against the window. The reality was devastating in its simplicity. Constance hadn't merely excluded me from Diane's second wedding. She had systematically erased me from our family's narrative. And perhaps the most painful realization was that I should have anticipated this culmination of decades of calculated diminishment. My mother, Constance Reynolds, had never bothered to disguise her disappointment in me. Diane had always been her masterpiece, her golden child who could do nothing wrong. The daughter who followed the precisely charted course, exclusive private schools, art history degree from a prestigious university, an MBA to ensure commercial success, and now a second marriage to an influential art dealer with connections throughout the international market. And me? I was the inconvenient reminder of paths not taken, the daughter who squandered her potential on a librarian's modest career rather than something suitably impressive for the Reynolds name. The one who wasted her prime years caring for a dying father instead of pursuing advantageous social connections. The one perpetually measured and found wanting. But what tormented me now wasn't simply the blatant favoritism. It was the dawning comprehension of the deliberate deception. Because I was beginning to understand that I hadn't merely been overlooked. I had been systematically eliminated from our shared history. With hands that refused to stay steady, I pulled my phone from my purse again, scrolling through years of one-sided communications with my sister. Message after message gained new, painful significance in light of tonight's revelation. "Diane, I found Dad's original sketches of the Hamilton building. I had them professionally preserved for you. Let me know when you're free to pick them up. I saw your gallery featured in the Arts Quarterly. So proud of you. Coffee sometime? Read 10:17 p.m. No response. I've set aside some of Dad's architecture books for your daughter's design studies. I know he'd want her to have them. Message undelivered." For years, I'd consoled myself with plausible explanations. Diane was establishing her gallery, navigating her divorce from Richard, building her brand, too consumed with her daughter's education abroad. But what if these justifications were merely comfortable fictions? What if she never received those messages? What if Constance had been systematically intercepting our communications, ensuring I remained nothing more than a fading shadow in Diane's glamorous life? A sister rendered into a ghost? I tucked the phone away with unexpected force, fighting the wave of nausea rising in my throat. This paralysis of questions needed to end. I needed concrete answers, irrefutable evidence, and I knew precisely where to begin my investigation. The moment I unlocked my condominium door, I headed directly to my personal library. Between neat rows of carefully preserved first editions and reference volumes sat several storage boxes containing my father's architectural papers, his legacy that I'd painstakingly organized and maintained after his death. I pulled down the box labeled financial/legal, My hands remarkably steady despite the emotional tempest brewing inside me. The contents were meticulously organized, a librarian's precision applied to personal documents. Inside, carefully preserved in acid-free folders, lay every financial record of support I'd provided to my family over the decades. Bank statements documenting transfers to Diane during her divorce proceedings, receipts for her daughter's art school tuition deposits, checks written for her first gallery's security deposit, notarized documents showing my contributions to our father's medical expenses. The papers documented decades of financial sacrifice, retirement funds diminished, savings depleted, security compromised, all to ensure my sister and father had what they needed. And my reward? Complete erasure from the family narrative. I drew a measured breath, channeling my emotional turmoil into focused determination. Indulging in unproductive anger would accomplish nothing. This wasn't merely about betrayal or hurt feelings. This was methodical theft of inheritance, of relationship, of identity. I positioned the box on my desk and powered up my computer. If Constance had invested such meticulous effort into eliminating me from our family story, she would soon discover I wasn't so easily erased. This wasn't about petty vengeance or emotional retaliation. I wanted justice, recognition, and accountability. I wanted Constance to finally acknowledge that I wouldn't simply fade into convenient non-existence. With the systematic approach honed through decades of research and cataloging, I began my investigation. Financial records first, I examined bank statements, tracking every dollar provided for Diane's benefit. Correspondence next, emails and letters exchanged with Constance during the period when she still maintained a pretense of familial inclusion. Finally, legal documents, particularly the file I'd preserved after Dad's passing, containing the details of his insurance policies and intended distributions. And that was when I discovered it, staring back at me from the screen with such stark clarity that my heart nearly stopped. A substantial insurance deposit, specifically designated for me in my father's policy documentation, had never reached my account. My breath caught painfully as I clicked through additional records. The funds had been deliberately redirected, the paperwork altered. Transferred to another name entirely, Constance Reynolds. My God, I whispered, the words hanging in the stillness of my apartment. My hands trembled as I zoomed in on the digital scan of the amended beneficiary form, examining the signature with shocked disbelief. The sickening reality crashed over me like a physical wave. She had stolen my inheritance, money that Dad had explicitly set aside to secure my future after decades of service to his architectural practice. But the financial theft, significant as it was, represented only a fraction of what she'd taken from me. Constance had systematically robbed me of choices, opportunities, dignity, and independence. She had confiscated the final gift my father had arranged for me, his concrete acknowledgement of my years of dedication, and redirected it to what? To subsidize Diane's luxurious gallery opening? To maintain the carefully cultivated facade of the perfect Reynolds family? My fingers curled into tight fists, nails biting into my palms with enough force to leave marks. For nearly 30 years, I carried the weight of guilt and quiet nobility, believing I had freely chosen this path of sacrifice for my family's benefit. The narrative I told myself, that I had willingly subordinated my needs to support Dad's business and Diane's artistic aspirations, had been a comforting fiction. The devastating truth was that I had never been offered any real choice at all. Sleep became impossible that night. Instead, I channeled my churning emotions into methodical investigation, applying the research skills honed through decades in library archives. I contacted my bank, requesting historical records. I generated comprehensive credit reports stretching back years. I placed a call to Harold Winters, Dad's trusted accountant who had managed the architectural firm's books, a man I'd worked alongside for years while helping Dad maintain his practice. Margaret? His voice carried genuine warmth when he returned my call. It's been, 5 years now? Too long, Harold. I need your help with something regarding Dad's estate. Hour by hour, piece by methodical piece, the complete picture emerged with devastating clarity. The insurance policy Dad had established specifically for me, redirected through a series of carefully orchestrated transfers. The educational fund I had painstakingly built for Diane's daughter, emptied without notification or consent. The carefully selected birthday gifts, handwritten letters, and heartfelt messages I'd sent to my sister over the years, intercepted, hidden, never delivered. For decades, Constance Reynolds had orchestrated an elaborate campaign to ensure I remained nothing more than an insignificant footnote in our family's carefully curated history. I had served my purpose as a financial resource, a behind-the-scenes support system with no voice, no visibility, no acknowledgement. And now she had executed the final excision, ensuring I was explicitly excluded from Diane's wedding celebration, an event fundamentally centered on family connection. She had methodically erased me. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across my desk, I stared at my computer screen where dozens of documents now formed an irrefutable body of evidence. The stark reality of what Constance had done glowed back at me like a loaded weapon. I possessed everything necessary to completely dismantle her carefully constructed narrative, to reveal her true nature to everyone she had deceived: Diane, Wesley, their wealthy guests, the social and business circles whose approval she so desperately coveted. I could obliterate her entire carefully constructed world with a single email attachment. The temptation pulsed through me with almost physical intensity. But no. This situation demanded a more measured approach. Constance had invested decades in crafting this elaborate edifice of deception. I would be equally deliberate in dismantling it. When the moment was perfectly right, when she least anticipated exposure, I would ensure Constance Reynolds experienced firsthand what it meant to be systematically erased from her own narrative. Because despite her meticulous efforts, my mother had fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about her eldest daughter. Librarians don't eliminate information, we preserve it. We catalog it. We ensure truth remains accessible. And I had no intention of quietly disappearing into the margins of this story. I stared at my computer screen, the harsh glow of financial records casting long shadows across my small apartment. Everything was meticulously documented now. Every wire transfer, every redirected deposit, every dollar of my father's insurance policy that should have secured my future but instead had been systematically stolen by my own mother. Constance Reynolds had orchestrated my gradual erasure over decades, and now she was celebrating what she believed to be her final triumph. She thought the matter was settled. She thought I had finally accepted my invisibility. She couldn't have been more mistaken. I had always recognized my mother's coldness, but there was something particularly calculating about how she presented herself in public spaces. The way she wore her carefully constructed reputation like an exquisite designer ensemble, perfectly tailored to command both envy and respect. I knew precisely where she would be this morning. The day after Diane's lavish wedding celebration, Constance would undoubtedly be holding court at the City Arts Museum's exclusive donor breakfast. It was her domain, the perfect venue to bask in reflected glory while simultaneously reinforcing her status among Chicago's cultural elite. For women like my mother, reputation wasn't merely important. It was oxygen, currency, and weapon all at once. And I had been the inconvenient blemish she'd spent years methodically removing from her immaculate public image. I could visualize her with perfect clarity, impeccably dressed in a tailored ivory suit, her signature pearls gleaming in the morning light as she sipped imported tea. She would be surrounded by her carefully cultivated circle of admirers and benefactors, regaling them with stories of Diane's perfect second wedding, undoubtedly expressing how relieved she felt that everything had proceeded flawlessly. Perhaps even manufacturing some elegant fiction about how unfortunate it was that I had declined to attend due to some fabricated prior commitment. My jaw clenched so tightly I could feel my teeth protesting. Constance had always considered herself untouchable. She had constructed her position of influence upon a foundation of carefully crafted deceptions, misappropriated funds, and expert manipulation. But every edifice, no matter how seemingly impenetrable, has its structural vulnerabilities. And after 30 years as my father's administrative assistant in his architectural firm, I knew exactly how to identify them. By mid-morning, I had assembled everything required: financial statements, bank transfers, insurance documentation, and even incriminating emails Constance had carelessly sent years ago when she still believed I was too intimidated to challenge her authority. Communications that revealed just enough of her intentions to complete the evidentiary puzzle. This confrontation would not be fueled by unbridled emotion. That wasn't my approach, not after decades of maintaining order in library stacks and architectural archives. I would first lull her into a false sense of security, then systematically dismantle the ground beneath her. I picked up my phone and, for the first time in nearly 6 months, called my mother directly. She answered on the third ring, her voice polished and controlled as though she had rehearsed for this precise moment. "Margaret, this is unexpected." Of course it was. She believed she had permanently severed our connection with last night's public humiliation. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation," I replied, deliberately keeping my voice calm and measured. "I was hoping we could meet in person." A lengthy pause followed, punctuated only by the delicate sound of fine china as she sipped her morning tea. "You and me? Whatever for at this point." To address some unfinished business, I allowed the ambiguity of my words to hang between us, offering just enough mystery to pique her interest. Constance thrived on maintaining absolute control, but she equally relished the satisfaction of victory, and she firmly believed she had already achieved a complete triumph over me. So, entirely as anticipated, she accepted my proposition. "Very well," she conceded, her voice carrying the sharp precision of a perfectly honed blade. "I suppose we can meet." I arrived deliberately early. The City Arts Museum's exclusive donor lounge remained exactly as I remembered, a carefully curated showcase of wealth and privilege disguised as cultural appreciation, all hidden behind pristine white tablecloths and overpriced champagne flutes. When Constance made her entrance, she radiated an unmistakable aura of triumph. Her entire bearing, from her perfectly coiffed silver hair to her designer pumps, proclaimed victory. "Margaret," she acknowledged, sliding gracefully into the chair opposite mine. She made no attempt at physical affection, not even the practiced social air kiss she bestowed on mere acquaintances. "You're looking adequate," she remarked, though the smug glint in her eyes revealed her expectation of finding me disheveled and defeated. She had anticipated my appearance would reflect the emotional devastation she'd orchestrated. I offered a measured smile instead. "And you're looking remarkably well for your age," I replied, the compliment deliberate in its subtle backhanded nature. I permitted her to savor her perceived victory momentarily. I allowed her to indulge in the illusion that I had requested this meeting to seek reconciliation, to make amends according to her terms. I let this misconception persist for exactly 5 minutes before systematically dismantling it. "You know," I began, placing my phone deliberately on the table between us, "I never truly believed you would excise me so completely from our family." Constance arched one perfectly shaped eyebrow, taking another sip of her tea with practiced elegance. "You removed yourself, Margaret dear. You've always insisted on making impractical choices." This was her customary justification. This was how she rationalized misappropriating my inheritance, concealing communications, and systematically making me an outsider within my own family. She classified it as necessary correction. She framed it as valuable instruction. But I now possessed irrefutable evidence of her deliberate deception. With methodical calm, I reached into my leather portfolio and extracted a single document. I slid it across the polished mahogany table. Her expression remained initially unchanged. Not until her gaze lowered to examine it. Not until she comprehended exactly what she was seeing. A detailed record of the redirected insurance payout, funds explicitly designated for me by my father. The color drained visibly from her face, transforming her carefully applied blush into stark contrast against suddenly pallid skin. I tilted my head slightly, observing with detached interest as she stiffened, noting how her manicured fingers tightened around her teacup as though physically attempting to maintain her rapidly deteriorating composure. "That money was specifically intended for me," I stated, my voice quiet but unwavering. "Dad explicitly designated me as the beneficiary." She remained momentarily silent, but I clearly identified the precise instant when her arrogance faltered. "I made necessary financial decisions for the family's overall benefit," she finally responded, though the characteristic confidence in her tone had noticeably diminished. "No," I corrected, leaning forward slightly. "You acted exclusively in your own interest." For the first time in decades, I witnessed something extraordinary reflected in her eyes. Fear. Not fear directed at me personally, but profound fear of losing the control she'd maintained with such ruthless determination. Because she recognized, with sudden clarity, that I possessed the capacity to completely dismantle her carefully constructed social position. "I haven't come to engage in pointless arguments, Mother," I stated, observing her reactions with the careful attention I developed cataloging rare manuscripts. I'm here to present you with alternatives. She attempted a dismissive scoff, her social mask sliding back into position. Alternatives? Yes, I responded smoothly. You can either rectify what you've deliberately damaged, or I will take action myself. I allowed the weight of this ultimatum to fully register. I gave her time to process its significant implications, because this wasn't an empty threat. I possessed comprehensive documentation. I had assembled everything necessary to ensure every influential figure in her carefully cultivated social and business circles understood precisely the kind of woman Constance Reynolds truly was. She might attempt to challenge me. She might try to fabricate another deception. But she understood, at a fundamental level, that she wouldn't prevail this time. Her empire was constructed on fundamentally unstable ground, and I was fully prepared to initiate its collapse. Her fingers trembled visibly as she reached again for her teacup. She concealed it admirably, but I detected it nonetheless. I witnessed the exact moment when Constance Reynolds realized her absolute control had finally been compromised. Fine, she eventually conceded, her voice thin and clipped. What exactly are your demands? I smiled with quiet satisfaction. We were finally making progress. Constance Reynolds had dedicated 7 decades to controlling narratives, weaving deceptions with such consummate skill that even the most skeptical individuals accepted them without question. She operated with absolute conviction that her power was immutable, that her carefully cultivated reputation was unassailable. That truth itself was merely another story she could edit to suit her purposes. She was profoundly mistaken, and today would deliver that uncomfortable revelation with crystal clarity. She regarded me from across the polished museum table, her impeccably manicured fingers clutching the edge of the document I had methodically placed before her. Irrefutable evidence of the redirected insurance funds, the substantial financial security my father had specifically designated for me, which had mysteriously materialized in her investment accounts instead. Constance's expression remained carefully composed, but after a lifetime of observation, I recognized her subtle tells. The almost imperceptible tightening along her jawline, the deliberately measured inhalation as she attempted to regulate her breathing. Her mind was calculating potential escape routes, evaluating whether denial or manipulation offered the more effective strategy. I deliberately allowed the silence to expand between us, permitting her to experience the uncomfortable weight of anticipation. Finally, she placed the document down with theatrical calm, folded her hands with practiced precision atop it, and offered a smile that never reached her eyes, cold and meticulously rehearsed. You're being unnecessarily dramatic, Margaret. A surprised laugh escaped me before I could contain it. I hadn't expected immediate capitulation, but to attempt gaslighting in the face of such incontrovertible evidence revealed a breathtaking level of audacity. Dramatic? I echoed, tilting my head slightly while maintaining unwavering eye contact. Mother, you systematically misappropriated funds that were legally and morally mine. How exactly does pointing that out constitute drama? She sighed with exaggerated patience, as though addressing a particularly tiresome child. I made necessary financial decisions, she stated with practiced smoothness. Your father's affairs were in complete disarray. There were significant outstanding obligations. I simply managed resources appropriately for the family's collective benefit. No, I countered firmly. You acted exclusively to serve your own interests. Her polished veneer cracked slightly, revealing a momentary flash of indignation. And let's be perfectly candid, I continued, leaning forward with deliberate calm. You never for a moment anticipated I would discover what you'd done, did you? Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Because we both recognized the truth. She had been absolutely confident in my continued silence and invisibility. She had methodically ensured I remained nothing more than an insubstantial shadow within our family narrative. Someone who wouldn't investigate, wouldn't challenge authority. She had never prepared for this version of Margaret Reynolds, the one who fought back with meticulous evidence and unwavering resolve. Well then, she said, clearing her throat while forcing her social smile back into place. What precisely are you seeking from this conversation? A familiar question, but the context had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't voiced from a position of authority, but from mounting apprehension. I took deliberate time formulating my response, observing her growing discomfort, allowing her to experience what decades of powerlessness had felt like from my perspective. I want my rightful inheritance, I stated with straightforward clarity. Every dollar with appropriate interest. She attempted dismissive incredulity. You cannot possibly expect. I extracted a second document from my portfolio and placed it before her with precision. A formal legal demand letter from a prominent estate attorney I had consulted the previous evening. It itemized with clinical detachment exactly what had been misappropriated, the comprehensive documentation substantiating these claims, and the potential legal consequences if restitution wasn't promptly arranged. Her eyes moved rapidly across the page, absorbing its implications. Her expression remained carefully controlled, but I observed the unmistakable tremor in her elegantly manicured fingers as she delicately returned the document to the table. You would actually proceed with this, she remarked, her voice noticeably subdued. Your actions eliminated any alternative approach. A weighted silence descended, a prolonged, heavy interval during which I witnessed the uncomfortable reality finally penetrate her consciousness. This wasn't merely an idle threat. It represented an irrevocable commitment. She could resist, could attempt to postpone the inevitable reckoning. But ultimately, she would not prevail. And for someone like Constance Reynolds, defeat represented the single most intolerable outcome imaginable. Constance didn't immediately capitulate that day. She offered no immediate concession. But I recognized the internal conflict raging behind her carefully composed expression. Because this confrontation transcended mere financial restitution. If I pursued legal action, if these documents became public record, the consequences would extend far beyond monetary loss. Her carefully curated reputation within Chicago's elite circles would crumble completely. And for a woman like my mother, public standing represented a currency far more precious than mere dollars. The following afternoon, my phone chimed with an unexpected message from Diane. Mother's behaving strangely. She keeps bringing you up in conversation. What happened between you two? I stared at my sister's text for several minutes, carefully considering my response. She's finally been caught in her deception. After a noticeable pause, another message appeared. What exactly are you implying? Ask her directly. She knows precisely what I've discovered. Because if there was one eventuality Constance Reynolds had never adequately prepared for, it was her golden child uncovering the elaborate web of lies she constructed. And this revelation represented my most powerful leverage. The inevitable confrontation required exactly 3 days to materialize. Just 72 hours before Diane appeared unannounced at my condominium door, her eyes blazing with a mixture of disbelief and fury, demanding explanations. 3 days before the carefully constructed barriers Constance had meticulously maintained between us collapsed entirely. Tell me she's fabricating excuses, Diane demanded, clutching the comprehensive financial documentation I'd provided, irrefutable evidence that her European art education, her gallery startup investment, even her lavish first wedding had been funded not through Constance's generosity, but through my misappropriated inheritance. Tell me she couldn't possibly have done something this reprehensible. I remained deliberately silent. No explanation was necessary because the documentation spoke with undeniable clarity. I observed the painful progression of comprehension transform my sister's expression as decades of carefully crafted deception unraveled before her eyes. She consistently told me you had voluntarily withdrawn from our family, Diane whispered, her voice uncharacteristically fragile. That you resented our success, that your career consumed all your attention and energy. I clenched my jaw tightly, fighting against a surge of long-suppressed emotion. And now? I asked quietly. What do you believe now that you've seen the evidence? Her fingers tightened visibly around the documents, crinkling the edges of papers that represented years of calculated betrayal. I believe you, Margaret. I should have questioned her version years ago. With that simple acknowledgement, Constance Reynolds lost her most prized possession, her perfect daughter's unwavering loyalty. Diane confronted her directly. I didn't need to witness the encounter. I could envision the predictable progression with perfect clarity. Constance would initially deny everything, then attempt to deflect responsibility, ultimately positioning herself as the victim of misunderstanding. But Diane wasn't the same malleable, dependent woman she'd been mere days earlier. And the moment she looked directly into her mother's eyes and stated, I know exactly what you've done, Constance's carefully constructed world began its inevitable collapse. Because Constance Reynolds' power had never been built upon genuine strength or integrity. It rested entirely upon the collective belief in her unassailability. And when that foundational myth shattered, her entire empire crumbled accordingly. Within 7 days, my inheritance was restored in full. Constance fought against this outcome with every resource at her disposal. She employed delaying tactics, attempted emotional manipulation, even offered substantial additional payment in exchange for my silence. But I remained resolute because this confrontation transcended monetary compensation. It represented accountability for decades of manipulation, extracted not through financial penalties, but through the loss of what Constance valued above all else: her carefully constructed legacy and reputation. Because now Diane understood the truth, and soon Constance's entire social and business circle would similarly comprehend her genuine nature. I didn't need to actively destroy her standing. She had accomplished that herself through decades of deception. I harbored no illusions that Constance would experience genuine transformation. Women of her generation and temperament rarely changed fundamentally. They simply adapted their strategies, discovered new manipulation techniques, identified fresh targets for their deceptions. But in this instance, she had exhausted her options. And as I observed Diane deliberately distancing herself, as I witnessed the panic that momentarily fractured my mother's carefully maintained composure when she recognized her irrevocable loss, I experienced an unfamiliar emotional response. Profound relief. She had methodically erased my contributions. She had systematically stolen my rightful inheritance. She had deliberately rewritten our family narrative to render me inconsequential. But ultimately, she was the one who found herself facing irrelevance. And me? I finally gained the opportunity to reconstruct my life according to my own authentic values, entirely free from her manipulative influence. Constance Reynolds had devoted nearly 8 decades to constructing an empire founded on systematic deception. She had manipulated people, distorted narratives, and meticulously crafted the perfect illusion of herself as the consummate mother, the devoted widow, the sophisticated patron of the arts. But illusions maintained their power only until subjected to careful scrutiny. And now, her carefully manufactured facade was being examined with unprecedented attention. The fractures in my mother's carefully controlled world didn't merely expand, they catastrophically collapsed. The dissolution began subtly enough. Hushed conversations that abruptly ceased when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged during charity functions, invitations that mysteriously never arrived. The exclusive social circles she had navigated with such precision showed absolutely no tolerance for perceived vulnerability. My mother, once celebrated as the epitome of wealth and taste within Chicago's cultural elite, now represented something infinitely worse: a liability. Diane had stopped accepting her calls entirely. The wedding guests had become aware of disturbing rumors. At the City Arts Museum's prestigious donor events, where Constance had once commanded deferential treatment, her name had mysteriously disappeared from priority invitation lists. She had invested decades meticulously cultivating her position of influence, yet it required barely a fortnight for that carefully constructed authority to completely disintegrate. I should have experienced profound satisfaction. Yet witnessing her systematic social disintegration provided none of the vindication I had anticipated. Because I recognized a fundamental truth about my mother: she had already been emotionally bankrupt long before these external consequences materialized. She had invested so many years attempting to erase my existence, so much energy manipulating Diane's perceptions, that once we withdrew from her orbit, nothing substantial remained. No genuine family connections, no authentic influence, no meaningful relationships whatsoever. I had foolishly believed I craved revenge, when what I truly desired was simply liberation from her influence. With my inheritance finally restored, unlimited possibilities stretched before me. I could have relocated completely, vanished from our shared history, mirroring the erasure my mother had attempted to impose upon me. Instead, I chose to reconstruct my life according to my own authentic values and priorities. I renovated my condominium, transforming one section into a small specialized bookshop focusing on architectural history and preservation. I resigned from my volunteer position at the local library to establish a community reading program for seniors. I traveled to various cities specifically to visit my father's lesser-known architectural projects, documenting them through photography and detailed journals. For the first time in nearly 6 decades, I made choices motivated by personal fulfillment rather than obligation or sacrifice. My sister's emotional recovery progressed more gradually. I harbored no resentment regarding this. She had spent her entire adult life under our mother's powerful psychological influence, accepting without question consensus carefully constructed version of reality. Unlearning deeply ingrained deceptions required considerable time and reflection. But progressively, Diane began recognizing our mother's true nature. The transformation manifested subtly initially, her growing hesitation before responding to Constance's increasingly desperate messages, her reluctance to defend our mother's actions in conversation. Then one autumn evening, Diane appeared unexpectedly at my door. She stood uncertainly in the hallway, hands buried deep within the pockets of her designer wool coat, looking simultaneously elegant and vulnerable. I should have questioned her narrative years ago, she admitted, her voice uncharacteristically fragile. I welcomed her inside, prepared coffee in Dad's old architectural blueprint mugs, and for the first time in decades, we connected as genuine sisters rather than adversaries manipulated by maternal machinations. Not as competitors for Constance's approval, not as Victoria Reynolds' daughters, simply as Margaret and Diane. I encountered my mother once more. The meeting wasn't planned or orchestrated. I was strolling through the downtown arts district on one of those perfect October mornings when the air carries the distinctive fragrance of fresh coffee and fallen leaves. She sat alone at an outdoor cafe table. The woman who had once commanded attention in every social gathering now appeared remarkably diminished, just another affluent older woman rendered increasingly invisible by age and declining relevance. She glanced up, momentarily meeting my gaze. For a brief instant, I wondered what communication might follow. Whether she might offer some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Whether she might finally concede defeat. But true to form, she merely raised her porcelain cup in a gesture of superficial recognition, offered a thin, emotionless smile, and deliberately redirected her attention elsewhere. Because ultimately, Constance Reynolds never truly lost, not according to her internal narrative. She simply recalibrated her perspective. And I had already invested far too many years attempting to secure genuine recognition from someone fundamentally incapable of providing it. So I continued walking, leaving her behind permanently. Liberating myself from her psychological influence required considerable time and effort. I frequently caught myself anticipating her critical voice in moments of decision, expecting to hear her familiar refrain about my fundamental inadequacy. But the process of reclaiming authentic identity doesn't occur in a single transformative moment. It materializes gradually through countless small revelations. It happens when you find yourself laughing spontaneously without calculating the social appropriateness of your response. It happens when you purchase a ticket to Barcelona specifically to view Gaudi's architecture without anyone questioning the practical value of such an expenditure. It happens when you glimpse your reflection unexpectedly and recognize with startling clarity the person gazing back at you. My victory wasn't achieved through destroying my mother's carefully constructed social position. I succeeded by building something infinitely more valuable, an authentic life aligned with my personal values, grounded in genuine relationships and meaningful work. I deliberately chose not to dwell on the past, understanding that true liberation comes from creating a life beyond the reach of manipulative influence. Betrayal manifests in countless forms. Sometimes it arrives with dramatic immediacy and undeniable clarity. More frequently, it infiltrates relationships gradually, with subtle persistence, embedding itself within the most intimate connections we form. But the essential question isn't whether betrayal has occurred, but rather how we choose to respond. After establishing my specialized bookshop and architectural preservation foundation, many visitors share similar stories of family estrangement and betrayal. I listen carefully, offering neither judgment nor prescriptive advice, simply validation of their experiences. Because while each situation contains unique complexities, the fundamental choice remains consistent: whether to invest energy in confrontation or redirect that precious resource toward building something better.